Welcome to Focus on the Facts, everyone. Today we're exploring this period, and what were some of the big, revelations that you came across that really made your mouth drop open?
Well, I was aware that this is kind of something where the people, the politicians especially, FDR notably had said, I learned that quote a long time ago, that nothing in politics happens by accident. If it happened, you can bet it was planned that way. And Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, of course, famously said the world is ruled by different personages than the public imagines behind the scenes. So I knew they were there, they were out there. Just found a lot more of them, but lots and lots of things I discovered that even I didn't know when I was writing this book. One of the things I've been talking about a lot, for instance, is that just when writing about the World War I era, I knew that there were people that were thrown in prison for protesting World War I, like Eugene Debs, the great socialist. But I didn't know that when you're just researching it, I found out that, we've all heard that expression, you have free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, I didn't know where that came from. And so I learned it myself that this phrase originated in the Supreme Court ruling during the World War I era by Oliver Wendell Holmes. One of these great so-called liberal heroes. It was a eugenicist in real life, and obviously didn't support free speech because he made this ruling, where he used that as an expression to support Woodrow Wilson's right to throw protesters of World War I in prison. Now, clearly, nobody protesting World War I was shouting fire in a crowded theater. But people don't know that's where that expression came from. And that was the first time that our government just stamped a huge asterisk next to the Bill of Rights. Because, and again, everyone understands you literally shouldn't be able to yell fire in a crowded theater. You could cause death and pandemonium. But in this case, he used a ridiculous example because he was talking about protesters of war. And I don't think very many people in the public know that. So that was the most revealing thing that I learned that even I didn't know. But, when I was studying, just going over some of the old presidents, William Henry Harrison, the guy who was the shortest tenured president we've ever had, served like 32 days, and famously caught pneumonia while delivering the longest inaugural address in history, and died like 30 days later or something. But he left a great quote on the record. I have it in the book, and I get it exactly right, but it's something like he was 68 when he died, so it was pretty old for those days. And he said, after a long career in politics, I've come to the conclusion that all of politics consist of making the rich richer and the poor poorer, something like that. So I thought that was kind of profound. But the rest of the stuff that I knew about Lincoln, I knew the other side of Lincoln. Studying it, of course, it's hard to imagine some of the things that were done.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because that's the point at which I had reached in your book, which talks about, as I'm reading this, I'm like, holy cow, this is the environment we are facing right now. I was, for example, you provide a quote in here on Vallandigham. How do you say his name? Vallandigham?
Yeah, Clement Vallandigham, I think, yeah.
Vallandigham. Okay, so he says in 1863, soon after the war began, the reign of mob was supplanted by the iron domination of arbitrary power. Constitutional limitation was broken down. Habeas corpus fell. We have that today. Liberty of the press, of speech, of the person, of the males, of travel, of one's own house, and of religion. We see under Loretta Lynch, or Obama, the habeas corpus was rescinded. Now we have indefinite detention, where you're denied access to an attorney. Your family doesn't know that where you even are. You're not charged. We have constant spying, which was the mail thing. We have people being restricted in their travel, their homes being taken from them and broken into by SWAT teams. And then he goes on to talk about the right to bear arms, due process of law, judicial trial, trial by jury. He names all of the things that we're facing today, and these were all under Abraham Lincoln. And he declared.
Yeah, that's why it's so crucial. That's why I talk so much about him, because so much of the tyranny that we see today began under Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. The 15 presidents before him, with the exception of James K. Polk, who was also, of course, rated highly. I mean, you'll notice when you look at what I call the court historians, when you look at how they rate these figures, invariably, they go for the most tyrannical ones, and they rate them the highest. So Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, people like that are rated very highly. James Polk is rated high because he took the first step, the first baby steps, to overstepping his constitutional bounds when he waged a war with Mexico, which then Congressman Abraham Lincoln rightfully objected to. But with the exception of him, the other 14 presidents before Abraham Lincoln did not, regardless of their political views, they understood their limitations under the Constitution. They did not try to overstep their authority. Abraham Lincoln just, he just smashed any concept of separation of powers. He did whatever he wanted. He didn't care. He tried to arrest the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when he rightfully ruled his suspension of the writ of habeas corpus to be unconstitutional. He shut down hundreds of newspapers. He threw thousands. We still don't know how many thousands of people he threw into makeshift prisons without charges.
The 40,000 number that you provided in your book, I was just like, what? You know, I mean,
yeah, they have no idea. I mean, some of them, most of the time, their families didn't even know where they were. And I provide some examples in there where people were just being arrested by, the kind of stuff you could see in other eras. I mean, even today with the Russia stuff, where they just, try to make some kind of absurd connection. I think one guy was arrested because his kids were waving a flag with blackberry juice or something ridiculous. It made no sense, and somehow they connected that to the Confederates, and he went to prison. But Lincoln set so many, because of what he did, and he was allowed to get away with it. He set so many bad precedents. So the stuff you talked about, the holding people at Guantanamo Bay, even torture, things like that. During the W. Bush administration, they were still citing Abraham Lincoln's precedents. During that, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt used the precedents to throw the Japanese, and as I wrote about in this book, the forgotten people that were thrown in concentration camps were German Americans and some Italian Americans. They didn't get any reparations, but he cited Lincoln's precedent because Lincoln did this, and of course Woodrow Wilson said throwing his people like Eugene Debs, and they got the Supreme Court approval for it. So this kind of tyranny, because we have deified Lincoln, now the court historians have, and most people, I know I'm going against the grain, obviously, of American society, because Lincoln is the secular saint of our civilization, and I have a whole section in there. When we celebrate Abraham Lincoln, what are we celebrating? But I think it says a lot about why America is at the state it's at. Right. And that is our hero. I mean, this is the secular saint, and the objective analysis of it shows that this guy was. I mean, there's so many things. Even the conduct of our troops now, where you have somebody like Chelsea Manning who sits in prison for just exposing, or could go back to prison, for exposing the atrocious conduct of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, playing soccer with severed heads and, killing dogs for sport and raping and pillaging. All that began under the Union troops because people like General Sherman, who was a vicious war criminal, if such a thing ever existed, this guy, invented the whole concept of total war and scorched earth policy. And the Union, and I have tons of examples in the book of what they were doing. They were starving the southern population, what was left, because pretty much every male that wasn't completely handicapped was fighting regardless of age, and they basically ran through the women and children that were left, and they raped most of them, and they pillaged, they stole their crops, burned their crops, salted and oiled the fields so that they couldn't grow anything afterwards, left them outside to die in the winter, burned their houses down, destroyed railroad. I mean, it's unbelievable what they did, and these were the good guys, and that's what I'm trying to point out is that when we celebrate this and we see the example, because of the example they set, and it was celebrated, then I talk about the World War II era, the so-called Greatest Generation. We saw a lot of that conduct, especially in the raping aspect, where the Allied troops raped so many women. In Japan, with Germany and Japan both, in Japan they had to actually open a brothel to try to channel their instincts out of it. So, but these are the good guys, and that's what I'm trying to point out is that history is written by the victors. We're hearing one side of it, and of course, when you talk about you're trying to defend the Confederates and the Nazis and the Japanese or whatever, then of course you're called racist or anti-Semitic or whatever. I'm just pointing out that we're hearing one side of it, and we have nothing to be proud of. And this book is just full of examples of incidents that are documented. This is not anything I made up. It's all hiding out there in plain sight.
Yeah, and a few of them that jumped out to me that, I mean, it's really like bang, bang, bang. It's must-read material for people. I think for most people, you need some sense of what is really happening in the world today in order to have the proper context for reading your book about these last 200 years or so. But I mean, for example, you write about how Frank T. Howard, the grandson of Francis Scott Key, was arrested and imprisoned at, the same place where his grandfather had written the Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah. I mean, how ironic is that? Yeah, the Fort McHenry. That's how many Americans know that? I mean, this is what was going on. So every time we sing the Star Spangled Banner, it's like the grandson of the guy who wrote that was imprisoned in the very same fort. But I don't think many Americans know that, but it's...
and you look at the NFL debate. You look at that ridiculous, stand for the flag kind of, national debate that's going on. It's like all such a farce. I mean, and then you point out how Lincoln arrested nearly the entire legislature of Maryland.
Yeah, exactly. Lincoln did so many things. Even I have a quote from one of the court historians. Again, I call them the court historians because they're the gatekeepers of the past. And so, when I'm posting and writing about current events or whatever, I'm referring to, what Gerald Celente calls the prostitutes, the mainstream journalists of today who lie and distort about current events. The court historians and the academics, they serve the same purpose with the past. And they're the gatekeepers of the past, and so they lie and distort that. So they make people, most often, they make people like Abraham Lincoln into heroes. And I draw a clear distinction in the book between the Founding Fathers, who I still revere, and people like Thomas Jefferson. I think he's the greatest statesman we ever had. And most Americans, I didn't know how, Abraham Lincoln absolutely despised Thomas Jefferson, and with good reason, because Jefferson would have despised him. But most people put Lincoln with the Founding Fathers when, in fact, what happened was when Lincoln came and trampled all over, there were two main concepts that our war for independence was fought on. The reason we became a constitutional republic, the first and foremost, was that we had the revolutionary concept of people everywhere have a right to consent to those who govern them, the consent of the governed. Well, in 1860, the southern states that seceded from the Union clearly no longer consented. So once Lincoln trampled all over that and the other 6 states joined, so you had 13 states that were fighting, and we lost almost 1 million. I think the newest estimate is 800-some-thousand deaths of people. Clearly, after that, the underlying message at the end was not that slaves were freed, but that was this voluntary. This union is not voluntary, and there is no more consent of the governed. So people that talk about the consent of the governed, you can't even really have the quotes from the Founding Fathers anymore because they're not relevant. They haven't been relevant since the 1860s, but people don't realize that. And they don't realize how Lincoln, sometimes they call it the Second American Revolution, and in a way it was. But it was a revolution against the Founding Fathers that Lincoln waged. And ever since then, before the Civil War, we were known as the United States was referred to as a plural. After the Civil War, and still today, it's a singular, United States is. And that's very, revealing. Because that shows what happened is they crushed the individual states' rights afterwards. And the idea of the Union under the Founding Fathers was 3 separate and equal branches of the government with checks and balances. Lincoln destroyed that as well because he became the first imperial presidency. And the judiciary under John Marshall, who was another revered figure to the court historians, had already destroyed that part of the checks and balances because the judiciary took on way too much power early on. And the legislative branch, especially during the Civil War, when the radical Republicans rubber-stamped everything Lincoln wanted to do, took a back seat, and we see that even today. When's the last time Congress has declared war? And they're supposed to declare war when we're in nonstop wars, but they just take a back seat. So we don't have 3 separate and equal branches. We have largely imperial presidencies, thanks to Lincoln. We have a judiciary that is completely out of control and has been legislating forever. I mean, we see that in all branches when, Donald Trump, the rare occasions when he's tried to do something he promised to do, some federal court somewhere will overrule him. That's unconstitutional. No federal court has a right to do that, but nobody points it out. And it's just allowed to happen, and the media reports it, both sides. Even Trump accepts it. Oh, well, we have to get rid of this judge down there. Well, under the Constitution, you are the head of the executive branch. The only one that can overturn anything you do would be the Supreme Court in a vote, or a majority or two-thirds of Congress. That never happens. It's just some politicized judge that we see everywhere, and we see this divisiveness now. Obviously, the Founding Fathers would be appalled by it. I mean, they would, but the arrest of Roger Stone and the railroading of him, and I'm connected to Roger Stone because he wrote the foreword to my first book, Hidden History, to the paperback edition. So, I have a vested interest because when people look that book up, they see Donald Jeffries with Roger Stone. So I don't think he's a criminal, but it brought to mind that pre-dawn raid with the SWAT team. That's what was, again, started during the Civil War. You mentioned Clement Vallandigham, who was Lincoln's foremost critic of the North. He was, I believe, an Ohio congressman. He was arrested in the middle of the night by troops, and that happened recently to Wolfgang Halbig, by the way, again, too. So we're seeing this kind of thing. I'm sorry,
Max Blumenthal, they're the same thing. SWAT team kicked in his door and arrested him, denied him access to an attorney, failed to charge him with anything, and thankfully someone else knew that he had been arrested and was able to get him out. I mean, none of the war criminals that are exposed by these whistleblowers and journalists are in prison. We saw the same thing, Glenn Greenwald. There was it's the same forces at work. And so that's what I'd like to talk about next, because, you're talking about what's happening with the judiciary today and how that was corrupted so long ago. And you also tackle the issue of these secret societies, the Freemasons and others, who clearly play a role in what we're seeing with regard to these usurpations and coups and ongoing endless wars. And so, you also point out, I mean, it's like I was also looking at a quote as you were talking about the Constitution, was that Patrick Henry, you point out, was a vocal opponent of the Constitution, which supplanted the original Articles of Confederations, and that he refused to attend the 1787 convention. And so you talk about the Constitution as something to be, sustained, but at the same time, how do you reconcile that in the face of what Patrick Henry was saying, and was he foreseeing what we are now witnessing in real time today?
Well, yeah, I think that somebody like Patrick Henry, Thomas, really any of the Founding Fathers outside of Alexander Hamilton, and it's no coincidence, I write about that a lot, that he's the one that they picked to decide to become a new black rapper on Broadway and make a hero out of, because he was the banker's favorite Founding Father. He was the father, the originator of debt. He's the one that got us into this debt-based, disastrous system, and, of course, wanted the central bank. He would have loved the Federal Reserve. That's what he wanted. And he would, if he was around today, he'd be at the Bilderberg meetings. He'd be on the CFR. He'd probably be going to Bohemian Grove. But none of the other Founding Fathers would be welcome anywhere in society. Maybe Benjamin Franklin, but certainly not Jefferson, Patrick Henry. I mean, if you just look at the quotes, I became, Patricia, as a little kid, I was excited by that Revolutionary era. That was always my favorite era of history. I used to read everything I could get my hands on, even as a little kid, about it. And I thrilled to the great quotes. And as a civil libertarian, Patrick Henry's quote, which he got from Voltaire, that I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to my dying day your right to say it. That's one of my credos, and nobody believes that anymore. Literally, they can't teach that, just as they can't teach George Washington's farewell address, in which he warned against becoming involved in other nations' affairs, because it contradicts every foreign policy of my entire lifetime, if not the entire 20th century. So they can't. That's why I talk about Hollywood has never had a movie devoted to George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, any of the Founding Fathers, except Hamilton, of course, because they want to steer away from that era of history. Unless it is the only reason the Founding Fathers are mentioned at all today in polite society, in our crumbling idiocracy, is to call them racist. And if Jefferson's talked about it all, it's not for his incredible accomplishments and the brilliant, timeless statements he left behind, first and foremost being the Declaration of Independence. It's to talk about Sally Hemings, to put her on an equal pedestal. It's ridiculous. But so you can't, and there's a reason for that, because if they talk about what they were actually doing, if they talk about their words, then what are they talking about? Overthrowing tyranny. Again, about a people everywhere having right to consent to those who govern them. The right to bear arms, which I have a whole section in there, which is that clearly their own statements make it absolutely clear they weren't talking about any kind of militia They were talking about individual right to bear arms. Free speech, of course, like Patrick Henry, that, even if I disagree with you, I'm going to support what you have to say. Because the First Amendment means nothing if it doesn't protect the speech of those you disagree with, because we all can agree with people that are saying what we say. Who doesn't agree with that? So the power of the First Amendment is that you have to protect the right of those you disagree with, but nobody does that today. Most, especially on the left, they want to get people fired over things that offend them, and in the case of more and more politicized prosecutions, like of Roger Stone, they want to imprison them. Because that's basically what Roger Stone is going to jail for, if he goes to jail, is for publicly denouncing the absurd Russiagate investigation. That's the so-called charge impeding an investigation, because he was impeding it by doubting it. And, of course, anybody with a brain would doubt it. But so it's a very slippery slope, and it really, studying a lot of these figures, John Quincy Adams comes off really well in my book. He talked about Freemasons. He had left tons and tons of detailed statements about Freemasons on the record. He was a very prominent member of the anti-Mason. There was an anti-Mason party. Most Americans probably don't know that. And he left another great comment about foreign policy when he said, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Well, that's all we've been doing my entire life, is going abroad and coming up with what H.L. Mencken called an endless series of hobgoblins. And the one now is probably Putin. Now they've tried to construct him into a hobgoblin. And people don't learn from history. Most of them don't know history. But I don't think we've ever had a situation like, and I've said this in many interviews, what we have today in America, where we have a framework for government. I still believe the constitutional framework, checks and balances, is the most perfect form of government that has ever been devised, that can be devised, because it does try its best, if it's run properly, to see that not too much power is concentrated anywhere. Because the essence of problem is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But you have the people today that are running things that swear allegiance to the Constitution. During this impeachment charade, you had Democrats talking about the Constitution. One of them even burst into flames. I mean, talking about the Founding Fathers, who would all would run from them in horror. They'd probably think they were witches or something. But they would not even understand this at all. But we still supposedly swear allegiance to this, and they don't pay the slightest attention to it. None of them believe in the Bill of Rights. Most of them don't believe in the Second Amendment, and very few believe in any aspect of the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, any of them. I mean, our police are allowed to violate the Fourth Amendment with almost everything they do, and nobody cares. So I don't think there's ever been, I don't know what goes on in other countries, but they have some kind of constitution or some kind of apparatus they're supposed to go by, and I can't believe that any place exists or has ever existed where the leaders of a country just pay so little attention to what George W. Bush called a worthless piece of paper. And that's the way they all treat it. And hopefully my book will open some eyes out there that aren't aware of just how far we've gone astray and how different things are from what the Founding Fathers envisioned when they founded the country.
Well, in terms of the consistency, I think that's one of the areas where, again, for people who are somewhat knowledgeable about the deceptions of today, to be able to read this body of work that you've put together here and see the parallels and how this is a systemic problem, not just a problem of individuals in the system. As you pointed out, these different branches have, the balance there is gone now. And one of these tactics that you also talk about is this, smear campaign against those who dare expose the corruption behind all of this, and you mentioned Thomas Jefferson, and I myself have often wondered about that, and could not reconcile the conflicting information I was getting, and I was really fascinated to read that in fact DNA tests proved conclusively that Jefferson could not have been the father of the child she bore at age 16. And this also reminds me of the Julian Assange smear today, where, the UN rapporteur on torture, Niels Meltzer himself, acknowledged that he had been duped by the smear campaign against Julian Assange, and only upon examining the evidence discovered that, in fact, there never were any rape charges ever actually filed. against Julian Assange. But, you know, it's incredible to me as I read your book that these same tactics are at work, you know, 100 years later. It's just like,
as Jim Garrison said, you know, during his investigation of the Kennedy assassination, he said, you know, he talked about the people that were covering the JFK assassination up, and he said, well, they have no reason to change their strategy. It's been very successful. And I think you can look at that in any of these areas. It's been working for them for a very long time. It's basically since the Civil War, and I think I go back to that era so much because so much of what we you know, when we go back to American history now, that's why that era, the founding of the Republic, and really the 90 years or so leading up to the Civil War, after the founding, is ignored by Hollywood, is ignored in the culture, unless, again, they distort it completely, as in Hamilton, the absurd play, things like that are obviously have no real history involved in it at all. It's just propaganda. But because they kind of start things from the Civil War, because that's when we started seeing the America that we see today, or the framework for it. We don't see the constitutional framework because that was shattered during the Civil War. And we never got that back, and we never have. And that's why, you know, when I was a little kid growing up in the 60s and the 70s, there were still, in Virginia, there were still a lot of what they called unreconstructed Southerners running around with Confederate flags and everything, because that instinct was still there, because they realized the lost cause and everything that they realized what had happened there and what the damn Yankees had done, and we're still living under that yoke because and not that the right side won, because, you know, of course people, you know, invariably tell you when you do that, okay, well, I guess you support slavery, and I say, look, of course, I'm the only person out there, I think, talking about the 40 million slaves in the world today, including 10 million in India, that none of you apparently care about. You don't talk about it. And where's the embargo against India? So it's not slavery you oppose. It's you just want to keep harking back to this era, and that's why when if the Civil War is analyzed at all, it's to talk about slavery and to look at it through the prism of today. And that's what today, the historians as such that exist, or any discussion of historical things, is through the prism of today. So, you know, it's to the point now where we may start seeing complaints about why there weren't any transgender figures in the 1830s. I mean, that's where we're at. And we look at it through the prism of today, and obviously it was a completely different world. And by our standards today, or the standards of the majority today, virtually every white person alive in the 1860s, let alone the 1770s, would be the most racist person in America today. That's just the way it was. But the lessons of history are not learned, and because of the way the slaves were freed, it's Ron Paul who wrote the foreword to my book, and I was very, very honored to have someone that I admire so much do that. As he said, you know, that led, because of the Reconstruction era, which I also analyzed in the book, which no one talks about anymore, the military occupation of the South, things like the KKK were born, 100 years, really, as Ron Paul said, 100 years of bad race relations. That's when the real racism began, the Jim Crow laws, the lynchings, and all that, the KKK, because of the way the war was fought, the way it ended, and the kind of punitive measures they put on the very proud Southerners that were left. And it just left a bad taste. And again, it set a precedent, because after the war, they hung Commander Wirtz of the Andersonville prison in Georgia. And I point out that, you know, here you had the Northern troops were robbing and pillaging and burning the crops, so that most of the Southern civilians didn't have food to eat. So how were the people running the Southern prisons supposed to feed the Northern prisoners? But again, they don't tell you this, that the Southern authorities were desperately they tried to trade prisoners with the North, because they said, we can't feed them, this is inhumane. They cared about humanity. Apparently the North didn't. And they refused that, and then they got to the point where they tried to just simply release them on their own. And the Northern troops round them up and put them back in the Southern prisons. I mean, are you learning that in history anywhere? Of course not. So who were the good guys? And then they hung this guy, Commander Wirtz, who by all accounts was a decent guy, who was doing his best in a bad situation. And because of that precedent, that's what directly led to what we saw first in the Treaty of Versailles, which led to most Americans don't know that. After World War I, we invented first of all, we hung that commander and had the Reconstruction of the South, which put a defeated foe under subjugation. You know, in the previous history of warfare, when it was over and you signed a treaty, that was it. And certainly the American colonies didn't try to do anything to the British after the Revolutionary War. But after World War I, we came up with this onerous Treaty of Versailles, which imposed financial penalties on Germany primarily, the losers. And most people don't realize, I published in my book, people are always astounded by this, Germany did not stop paying reparations from World War I until the year 2010. So that's how stringent they were. So, of course, the Germans were devastated. Our depression that we had here in America was a walk in the park compared to what was going on in Germany. And that's why Hitler and of course Hitler had lots of mysterious powers behind him. You read the book Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, just like Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. They show you these forces, these people largely don't come from, just out of nowhere. They have powerful horses behind them. But what he was saying was welcomed by a German population that had been beaten down. And it led directly to World War II because he started, getting the people together and building up an army and so forth. But if it hadn't been for that reparations,
he eliminated usury. He eliminated the bankers. We see that with Gaddafi. I mean, these are all the same patterns that repeat. And as you point out, like with the domination of the South, this was, a brutal annexation of land and people that did not want to be ruled by, the hostile actors, and no one. And again, there were banker interests behind that. And so my question to you, as you were talking about this and how we've been at war, I mean, and the conditions under which the Southerners were forced to live, we see this theme also of the intentional division of these communities and peoples and nations with the goal not being to necessarily it's a controlled chaos. The idea is to get everyone agitated just enough and fighting with each other to make it more easier to manipulate them. And what you described about the South seems to me, these same imperialist practices at work that have been used by different empires, but to the same ends, where it's just these military occupations and the complete subjugation, and then how these groups like the KKK arise out of sheer, stress from
desperation. Yeah, and these things, and you can see how these things evolve. Where we had Reconstruction after Civil War, which was unprecedented. You had after World War I, you had reparations, penalties, financial penalties, onerous financial penalties imposed on the losers in a war. Again, nobody had ever basically sued, or I don't know what you would call it, just imposed penalties on a defeated opponent. Again, that's just not, you can't find that in the history of warfare. And then they took the final step, hopefully I don't know what else they can come up with after World War II. And I believe I'm the first writer to write critically about the Nuremberg trials, probably in 60 years, if not more. And I think it was the antithesis of justice, but it was the next step where it said, okay, first of all, we've imposed financial penalties. Now we're going to legally try those that we defeated in war. As Robert Taft, said that, this is unprecedented. You can't. This is the victors trying the vanquished. Nobody had ever thought to do that before. But again, we're so lost as a society, Patricia, that everybody. Well, you can't find anybody but me. I know I'm a lone voice of the wilderness in this. That nobody on the left or right is looking at this and saying, wow, that was awful, especially the way it was done. Because if you read the way Rudolf Hess, who was sentenced to this incredibly cruel and unusual punishment in Spandau prison, where he's the only prisoner for decades until they probably killed him at 90-some years old and claimed he killed himself. But you read about his imprisonment, and he was not a Nazi leader engineering the Holocaust or anything. This guy was a genuine peace guy who tried to fly a solo mission to Britain to end against Hitler's wishes, and was captured and was just considered one of the worst Nazi war criminals, which made no sense. Others, of course, were executed as well, but then you had several Nazis brought in under Operation Paperclip that helped with our intelligence services, and people like Werner von Braun, who built NASA's program. So it made no sense. And of course, where were the Japanese people? The Japanese war criminals. They didn't go to trial. And in fact, I think the Emperor Hirohito lived, I think, until the 80s or something. So people don't ask these questions until I started doing it. And at the time, I point out, I have the books. How many people know that John F. Kennedy, a great liberal hero of mine, a classical liberal, his great book, Profiles in Courage, which everybody still kind of nods in appreciation of yet. Well, one of the chapters was about Senator Robert Taft and his opposition to the Nuremberg trials. Now, I don't think 1 in a billion people in the world know that, because that goes against the grain. Wait, JFK left quotes on the record, like many liberals did at the time, that this is horrible. This is horrific. You can't try the losers in a war in court, but we did. And now, people celebrate it. And actually, one of JFK's other chapters was devoted to, I don't have the guy's name in front of me at this time, but it's in the book, where the senator who cast the deciding vote in the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. And in that case, Andrew Johnson was basically impeached because he was opposing Reconstruction, or at least the onerous Reconstruction. So JFK was, saying that, hey, this is my idea of courage. This is one guy that opposed, that basically was sympathetic towards somebody who opposed Reconstruction, and another one who was critical of the Nuremberg trials. But people you don't have anyone mentioning that. So I think that's what when I get feedback on my work, I hear from people who didn't know these things, or say, wow, I've never heard anybody else say that before. But that's what fascinates me, is those kind of tidbits, and how we can see today, because we let these things happen, these kind of things when you have the political prosecutions of people like Stone and maybe Alex Jones down the road, that kind of thing, because we allow these kind of politicized things to happen, and our courts are so politicized now that basically, if you walk in any courtroom and if it's some kind of charge that relates to politics or personal opinions, you're at the mercy of who appointed that judge. So when Roger Stone walked into that courtroom and Amy Berman Jackson was an Obama appointee, I'm sure she was mortified by every bit of his political conviction. So what chance of justice did he? Because these judges can't. Theoretically, we shouldn't know any judge's political persuasion, just as we shouldn't know any journalist's political persuasion. But you turn on a television network, is there any, within 2 minutes, you can determine pretty much who every journalist voted for, whether they're a so-called liberal or so-called conservative. So we're just completely lost, and unfortunately, I'm probably writing history books at the wrong time, because Americans are largely historically illiterate, and I know I'm writing for a limited audience, but I'm hoping that the more people read it, they'll turn others onto it, and word of mouth will pass, and people will start realizing that the past is prologue, like Shakespeare said, and if you don't learn from the past, you're condemned to repeat it, like Santayama says. So we need to understand that what's happening today has a direct correlation to the past, and it's because of all these things. It's like a long mathematical equation. When you see in those movies, they're writing on the glass thing, and they have tons and tons of numbers. I don't really understand, but if any one of those numbers is wrong, the answer can't be right. So all these things I'm talking about, these are wrong numbers. So clearly we can never, get any kind of correct answers until we correct those things. And we can't get rid of the corruption, that's what I write about. Everything I write about is trying to expose corruption, and I believe that we're an utterly corrupt society, but I think we have been for a long time, and it's because of these kinds of things that happened, and the majority of Americans put up with it, they accepted it, and at this point, unfortunately, probably a majority support it.
At one point, I think you even quote, was it Thomas Jefferson, who said that those who don't read newspapers are better informed than those who don't. And, interestingly, a modern-day corollary would be, when I was watching the violent coup in Bolivia, where the people of the Altiplanos knew exactly what was going on, yet your average American, when it was the U.S. that actually paid for and sponsored and trained and bribed all of the bad actors in the coup, Americans had no idea what was going on. It's amazing. They're not uninformed, they're horribly misinformed, which I think is even worse. And I think the point that Jefferson was sort of getting at. And as you point out, most people have no idea about any of this. We have truly been fed a complete inversion of the truth. And where my own experience, this is something, obviously, you've been at this many years and have been seeing the truth of what's going on for many years. I, on the other hand, am somewhat new to it. In my work, I witnessed the weaponization, for example, of the SEC, and how hedge fund managers very cleverly hired firms to plant, fake stories in order to hurt their competition, or they'd persuade an SEC official to open an investigation without there ever being an investigation, but just the mere act of having that investigation open cripples a public company in many different ways. So it is an unfair advantage, but it goes on all the time. But and so on the political side, this is all new to me, and the mere idea of inversion that we've seen. Though I will say, when you pointed out that Americans are still pretty ignorant, I can't argue with you on that, except to the extent that it seems to me in the 3 years that I've been at this full time, trying to understand what's going on and sharing information and building a research group, that we're on the now at the point where people are confronting the truth about the Holocaust. And when I think back to 3 years ago, and most people had no idea what was even going on in Palestine today, much less any of these other countries, and that now we're at the point where we can confront the lies around the Holocaust, which is sort of like, the untouchable subject. People are in prison in Germany for even, look at Ursula Haberbeck. Is a 90-something-year-old woman in prison today for daring to question the historical facts around.
And how close are we to that here? Because it's like I purposely didn't really mention the Holocaust in my book, even though I talked about it. I preferred to go and discuss Allied war atrocities to try to show again that we don't, because I don't think. And I think what happens is something like the Holocaust. I'm very familiar with that, and I doubt the truth about almost anything that has been reported to us. So I think, especially the World War II era, and that's why I wanted to write about the bombing of Dresden and all the horrible things that Allies, the rapes, the mass rapes that they occurred, just to show that history is written by the victors, and that doesn't mean, unfortunately, for a lot of people, means then you like Hitler and they were the good guys. I don't think anybody knows in these productions if there are good or bad guys, but we're getting one side of it, and certainly the Holocaust has become such a big industry. And I've said many times, you should be able to dispute any historical event without having to go. It doesn't matter. Again, as a civil libertarian, I don't care whether you're wrong or right. Whether it's the moon landing, the Earth is flat, or the Holocaust, or anything, no matter how controversial it is, you ought to have the right to do that, and you certainly shouldn't be thrown into prison for it. But unfortunately, around the world, even places like Canada, who compares pretty favorably to our society in many aspects now, has a law like that, right? Ernst Zundel, if you remember, went to prison there, and so it's just a horrible time. But you're right. I think about there are more people that are waking up. Definitely, the problem is the people that are asleep are more asleep than ever, and they're digging their heels in, and that's why they're coming up with these, wanting to basically with hate crime laws and hate speech and all this nonsense. And you can't have free speech if there's such a thing as hate speech. It contradicts the First Amendment, but so many people use that. Every time I see somebody use that term, I try to tell them that, but they just don't get what a slippery slope it is, and it all leads to that same end. That what you're saying is, no matter what it is, that you've gone beyond the pale here. I believe in free speech, but comes to the Oliver Wendell Holmes thing. That's why it was so dangerous to accept that. There's no, you can't put an asterisk on it. There's no free speech except for that's going too far. No, because it's not free speech then. You already have laws against, terror, threats against people or whatever, inciting violence. So there's other laws in the books that cause that. But free speech is free speech, and you ought to be able to say and write whatever you want. If not, the First Amendment doesn't mean anything. But I'm trying to, and we're seeing that today with the internet, where shows like this and Little Shall I Do Weekly and lots of other great podcasts out there. That's where people are getting the alternative information, and unfortunately, YouTube especially is cracking down on these things so much. And when we can just sit by and people accept, I tried to write about that on social media when that awful CEO of YouTube, I can't remember her name, but they bragged in the interview with Leslie Stahl, who is a typical old-line journalist who has never investigated anything in her life. Wouldn't know a story if it bit her in the ass. But she just kind of sits there and smiles and nods, and the CEO brags about, we've eliminated 70% of controversial, in other words, truthful or alternative material.
Right.
from YouTube, and it's very dangerous. And we have to, because this is it. Because if the FCC gets on the internet, then, or something like the FCC, then we won't be having this conversation. Because, we can't go on television and any of the television networks because of the FCC. I mean, I've been on radio talk shows, but most of them are internet-based. I've been on a few, I guess, AM radios, and coast-to-coast AM I've been on many times. But for the most part, that stuff is really censored, and they know they have certain parameters. So you can get on, you can discuss the conservative liberal paradigm, but you can't get it. You start talking about what I'm talking about in this book, the meat and potatoes, that Lincoln was a tyrant, or that the Nuremberg trials were the antithesis of justice. The most controversial things in my book, I'm not going to find any platform for that outside the internet. So we have to try to keep this free. But unfortunately, again, they're making headroads. And I mentioned Alex Jones earlier. When they took him down, that was like a Lexington and Concord moment where you can see things unraveling since then. And unfortunately, he had a lot to do with it because he allowed himself to be taken down when he did his stupid apologies and started running away from people that he should have been helping, and started jumping on this neo-conservative nonsense where he became basically a Fox News light. But he was the biggest name, and once they took him down, they became empowered, and there are lots of other peoples that they've taken down. So we have to hope they don't come after us, and that we have this platform. But more people that go to shows like this and support it, and then that's the way you can help. But other than that, I don't know when we can reach a critical mass, but it has to be a point where we have a majority of people that are awake, and I don't think we have a majority of people, Americans, awake, even though there's increased interest in young people especially are getting it, but we still need, of course, the people that are awake, too, they're awake in different ways, because with Trump, his personality has divided him, so there aren't people awake to the disparity of wealth and things like that this brand of capitalism is failing most people, and there are the other people that are awake to the kind of New World Order type of conspiracies, but they don't come together. There's not much of a crossover because of Trump, and so that's why I think Trump was selected, because he's divided people. I've lost so many friends that I lost people that wrote glowing reviews to my first book, Hidden History, because I initially supported Trump, and they just can't handle it, and it's sad, but whether we can come together, I don't know, but right now the people are really, really divided, and I just sit there and shake my head when I see them arguing over the stupid, Kardashian type things they argue about. But it's hard to get them focused on real, meat and potatoes history, like I'm writing about, when they're just so distracted on such stupid stuff.
True, it is. There was one other story, but we're almost out of time. But I wanted to mention, you go into Benjamin Franklin and his ties to Masonry, and the discovery of those bones underneath his residence. It made me think of Ronald Bernard. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a former banker, international banker, and he talked about how among these people, this cadre that he worked with, that included foreign leaders and other powerful individuals, that in fact, human sacrifice was not only practiced but required. As part of these secret societies, you had to compromise yourself in such a way as to make it possible that you could be manipulated. And I love how you say that nobody thinks that he could have possibly killed these people, despite the fact he was living there.
No, he didn't do it. And that's the thing, is the way they responded to it is that, and this is what invariably happens. They'll trot out an academic, they'll trot out a court historian to explain away something. Now, these have been bones found in Thomas Jefferson's home, Patrick Henry maybe. Then it would have been a whole different critical examination of it. Because, Jefferson was having, he was raping Sally Hemings, so who knows?
Right.
These were slave. I mean, there would have been a whole different aspect of it. But Benjamin Franklin is the second most protected founding father behind Alexander Hamilton. He's a great man in many ways, and I quote his wonderful, timeless quote, "There's no such thing as a good war or a bad peace," many times. But he was, as you note, he was a member of the Hellfire Club, which was a really blasphemous. Also, they held very apparently sex and magic rituals far below the was an old monk abbey, and they had prostitutes that would dress up as nuns. I mean, you have to have a really particular bent mind, especially talking about in the 1700s, to come up with something like that. And one of their credos that they were the first ones that we know of. They came up with that expression, that anti-Christian expression, "Do what thou wilt," which Aleister Crowley, of course, the great beast, that was his personal motto. But apparently, they said it a couple hundred years first before him. But he had a lot of very troubling aspects to his character, as opposed to a lot of the founding fathers, although undeniably brilliant. But the skeleton, the bones, the human bones found. Typically, that ought to bring anybody under scrutiny or suspicion. If you're suddenly found, I mean, how many houses they have human bones? 30-some skeletons or whatever it was. I don't know if because it wasn't updated. I tried finding updated stories about it. It kind of dropped it. Like a lot of these stories get dropped, and there are no updates on it. But so they think, I guess they explain it at the time, and Americans have a very short attention span. And the things I write about typically, I'll have readers say, Hidden History or this book. We'll say, "Wow, I'd forgotten about that," or "Yeah, I better remember it," because we forget these things, and there's so many conspiratorial type
that's
things.
That's the thing. Yes, I think that's the one message that I try and drive home to people who really want to try and get involved and make a change is that repetition of this information frequently is absolutely required. I mean, this is a learning process. People are, we're having to relearn all of this, and the same methods that were used to drill the, false narratives into our brains are the ones we need to employ in order to digest properly this, the real history. I was reminded as I was reading what you wrote about Benjamin Franklin. I had read two histories, Founding Mothers and Ladies of Liberty by also the court historian Cokie Roberts. And
she's a court historian.
Yes, but she did reveal a little bit of truth about Franklin in that she pointed out, his wife, I think Deborah, was left. He left her to manage their farm, and the only time she ever heard from him, which would be, sometimes years that she wouldn't hear from him, he'd want money. She was there running the farm to support him while he was, off trying
and having Calvin's affairs. I mean, I guess the 1700s, he was like a libertine, and he certainly didn't look the part, but somehow he was a stud in Paris. I don't get it, but well, I found that fascinating. He's apparently his pickup line that he used to use was he'd come up to girls and say, "Would you like to join me in the pursuit of happiness?" Just picture that. Who would ever think that? But who knows how many other stories there are like that that are hidden from history.
Well, all righty. Well, tell us where people can find you, Donald, and what you're up to right now, so that people can follow your work.
Well, my blog is donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. Keeping it real. It gets lots of followers and attention, so you can find my, pretty much regular rants and ravings on there, and I write about things that promote things there. And the book that we're discussing today is Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776-1963, The History They Didn't Teach You in School, has a foreword by Ron Paul. That's relatively new still, but I have a brand new book that just came out a couple days ago, and that's a whole different subject, but I write about social issues as well. It's called Bullyocracy, How the Social Hierarchy Enables Bullies to Rule Schools, Workplaces, and Society at Large. Has blurbs from people like Jesse Ventura. Whole different subject, but it's everything I write about, whether it's Survival of the Richest, which is a book about the economy. I mean, I try to I focus a lot on the conspiracy stuff, which I have 2 books on that, but I also write about economic issues, and in this case, social issues, because I think there's corruption everywhere, and everything I do, I'm kind of the last of the do-gooders. I'm trying to expose wrongdoing and get people to realize it's there, because we're never going to get any better as a society until we basically need a huge vacuum cleaner. We need to vacuum out the people that are destroying this country at all levels, and it's basically that we have the wrong people in charge, and we could just inject honest people at all levels, and you would have. I mean, the only reason that my kind of history books are able to be written is because court historians and professional so-called journalists don't do their job. and they don't report the truth. They hide this information or they distort it, and that shouldn't happen if we had honest people ruling us. So I'm easy to find. You can Google me and find lots of other my interviews, and you can find I'm very active on social media, so I have a pretty big online presence.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Donald Jeffries. We'll see you back
Thanks for
here
having
next week, everyone. Have a great afternoon.